Autumn's chilly winds blew through the old trees, carrying the scent of decaying leaves and ripe pumpkins. Halloween was just around the corner, and the town was bustling with preparations for the year's grandest festivity. As a child, I loved this time of year, with its costume parties, candy, gathering, and spooky tales told by the fireside. However, there was one particular story that had always stayed with me, a story whispered in hushed tones during those autumn evenings. The legend of the Pumpkinman. Pumpkinman was a terrifying figure, according to the tales, who roamed the desolate fields outside the town every October. These stories had frightened me as a child, but now, as an adult, I was determined to investigate if there was any truth behind these chilling legends. One chilly October evening, I decided to embark on an adventurous walk through the fields surrounding the town. The pale moonlight cast eerie shadows through the gnarled branches of ancient trees, setting a spooky atmosphere. I had intentionally left my flashlight at home to make the experience more authentic, but I would soon come to regret that decision. I strolled along a narrow path that cut through a cornfield, the sound of my footsteps crunching in the fallen leaves being the only audible backdrop to the eerie silence. The scent of fallen leaves and ripe pumpkins filled the air, making me feel as though I were alone in this desolate world. As I ventured further into the field, I noticed something peculiar. In the middle of a small clearing, surrounded by tall corn stalks, stood an enormous pumpkin. It was utterly perfect, with its luminous orange skin glistening in the moonlight. I couldn't help but be impressed by its beauty. There was something extraordinary about it, as though it harbored a secret. I approached cautiously to inspect the pumpkin's crown when an unsettling feeling washed over me. A cold shiver ran down my spine, and I quickly turned around. There, in the shadows, stood a terrifying figure. Draped in tattered rags, he clutched an old scythe. But what chilled me the most was the gigantic pumpkin that covered his face. I could feel his gaze fixed upon me, and I was frozen like a statue. My body refused to move, and my thoughts were a jumbled mess of fear. It was then that I realized I was face to face with Pumpkinman, the entity I had heard about in the horror stories. Pumpkinman stood motionless, and I tried desperately to break free from his terrifying gaze. I heard a faint, sinister laugh, as if he knew I was afraid. Then, with a swift motion, he lifted his scythe and, with a powerful stroke, severed the pumpkin crown from its stem. I heard the sound of metal slicing through the plant as the crown tumbled to the ground with a muffled thud. I realized this was some kind of ritual, something I couldn't comprehend. Pumpkinman bent down, picked up the severed pumpkin crown, and raised it above his head, muttering incomprehensible words. I could feel the air around us growing dense and electric, and I realized I couldn't stay any longer. I forced my legs to move and ran away. I ran as fast as I could through the cornfield, away from the terrifying sight. My thoughts were spinning, and I tried to convince myself that it was a nightmare, but I knew it was real. Pumpkinman was real, and he was out there in the night. When I finally reached my car, I could still sense his presence, his eyes on my back as I drove away. I had never felt such fear in my entire life. I tried to assure myself that it wasn't real, that Pumpkinman was just a part of a horror story. But something inside me knew better. When I got home, I tried to find answers. I couldn't shake the thought of Pumpkinman and what had truly happened out in the fields. I delved into old legends and stories about him and discovered a world of mysteries. Pumpkinman was an ancient spirit, a protector of the harvest, but also a vengeful force against those who disturbed his realm. He was considered a symbol of both bountiful harvests and ominous misfortunes. I realized I had entered a realm of supernatural forces, a world I had never believed existed. The days grew shorter and the nights longer as Halloween approached. I couldn't escape the thought of Pumpkinman and his enigmatic ritual. I felt that he had an agenda, that he wanted something from me. I decided to return to the fields to try to understand what he wanted, and if there was a way to appease him. I packed a backpack with essentials, including a flashlight, a sharp knife, and a pumpkin from my own garden. I had heard that Pumpkinman was associated with pumpkins, so I hoped this would be a gesture of peace. I felt like a character in a horror movie as I prepared to venture out into the fields once again. On that chilly evening, the atmosphere was heavy with anticipation as I returned to the cornfield. I walked along the same path and reached the clearing where I'd first encountered Pumpkinman. I couldn't help but feel a pounding nervousness in my stomach. I knew I could encounter him again at any moment. But something was different this time. The clearing was empty, and there was no sign of Pumpkinman. I picked up the severed pumpkin crown he had left behind and replaced it with my offering, a pumpkin from my own garden. I set the pumpkin crown beside the old one and sat in the shadows to wait. I was determined to understand, to find answers to what Pumpkinman wanted. Hours passed, and I remained alone in the quiet night. Pumpkinman didn't appear. I began to doubt myself, my own memories. Perhaps it had all been a dream, a hallucination. Maybe fear had gotten the best of me the first time. I stood up and turned to walk back to my car. That was when I saw him. Pumpkinman had emerged from the shadows and was now closer to me than ever. His cold eyes stared at me, and I couldn't see his face behind the gigantic pumpkin. I was trapped, and I realized my attempts to appease him hadn't gone unnoticed. Suddenly, I heard his voice, a whisper that felt as though it came from another world.
You have returned. Why?
I tried to swallow my fear and answer. I wanted to understand, to know if you were real, if the legend of Pumpkinman was true. Pumpkinman seemed to contemplate my words. He noticed the pumpkin I had left as a peace offering and picked it up. His hands moved over it gently, as though he could feel its energy. The truth about me has faded with time, he said. Fewer and fewer believe in me now, and my power wanes. You have shown me respect through your offering, and I have heard your desire to understand. I will share my stories, my knowledge of the harvest, and the richness of this land with you. But you must promise to share this with others, to keep the memory of me alive. I nodded and pledged to honor our agreement. Pumpkinman seemed satisfied with my response and even displayed a rare smile, though I couldn't see his face. Then he began to tell stories of days gone by, of bountiful harvests and joyous celebrations. I listened intently to his words as time passed, and the night grew darker. When his stories were finished, he stood up and moved back into the shadows. Before he disappeared, he said one final time, "Remember me and my stories. Preserve the memory of Pumpkinman and the harvest, and I will always watch over these fields." Then he was gone, and I was alone in the field once more. I returned to my car, and as I drove home, I felt an odd sense of relief. I had encountered Pumpkinman, and instead of terror, I had found understanding. He was more than just a terrifying legend. He was a guardian of the harvest, a being who wanted to be remembered. Since that night, I have shared Pumpkinman stories with anyone willing to listen. I have tried to honor his memory and preserve the tradition of a bountiful harvest. Halloween is now more than just a night of fright for me. It is a time to remember and celebrate Pumpkinman and all he represents. So, if you ever venture out on a chilly October evening and spot a lone pumpkin in the middle of a cornfield, be cautious. You may encounter Pumpkinman, but if you show respect and a desire to understand, you might discover that he has much to share.